Hello and welcome to another Decktech video on Blutzoll Feuerball. Today we will be discussing Sultai Midrange Highlander, and we do this in English to honor the fact that there is people abroad playing our lovable format. So I know of communities playing Highlander in Finland and Slovakia and probably other places in the world, so enjoy this video in not German today. So the deck Sultai Midrange is a deck that I created, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, and the initial idea was to fuel the graveyard with small cantrip spells and then gain value out of this by playing delve threats. So create little card advantage and then use the thus filled graveyard to play cheap threats and have probably either early threats or mana open to react with things that the opponents might do. So the big advantage of playing Sultai is that you have blue and black at your disposal, which are very, very strong colors at the moment in the current meta, because you have hand control, such as the classical duress, Thoughtseize, Inquisition, that are almost always played when black is one of the colors, and have even additional access to Thought Erasure, Hymn to Torage, Collective Brutality as more hand control options, which makes black a very strong option in times where combo decks are strong. And on the other hand, also always strong when combo decks are around is counter magic, which blue offers, of course. And also the cantrips and the delve thingies are also things that happen a lot in black. And the choice of green as a third color is debatable. I mainly did this to run some sweet green cards, which was in the time before Uro and Oko got printed, but it hasn't gotten worse ever since they were printed. And Grixis Tempo Highlander has a very similar approach, I think, and I think I wanted to do something different, as I had tinkered around before with white, having a little more control-ish version of a Esper Flash Delve control deck. I wanted to try something new, and Sultai Midrange wasn't around really at that time, but Grixis was, so I chose green as a third color to have some design space to find solutions for myself rather than copying decks from the net, which I don't like. So the core part, or the one half of the core part of the deck, as I said, is cantrips. So small spells that generate little card advantage, or rather some selection advantage, such as Ponder, Preordain, Brainstorm. You don't end up with more cards than before, but you have made some small card selection and thus gained minor advantage. And every spell in the graveyard is fuel for our delve threats, which I'll talk about in a minute. And aside the classical Brainstorm, Ponder, Preordain, there is interesting self-mill cantrips, so Mental Note and Thought Scour, which are known from other formats as grave-filling delve fuel. So they make total sense in this deck, hence they're included. And Cadexian Probe is a fantastic cantrip. I would almost run it in every Highlander, regardless of color, because it gives free information for 0 mana and cantrips, which is very fine. Theros Beyond Death brought us Cling to Dust, which is a cantrip when you exile a non-creature card, and 3 life if you exile a creature card. So it's part-time cantrip, and it can escape for exiling 5 other cards and 4 mana, which is rather clunky. But there is combos around that need the graveyard, and you might win a game or two against Thassa's Oracle combos if you Cling to Dust the Oracle in response to a reanimation spell, for example. And then there is sort of cantrips on steroids that have been printed in the last years. So Once Upon a Time is a free spell when it's the first one, and it's still a fine spell if it's not the first one. 2 mana instant, which gives you a card selection out of 5. So classical cantrip, no card advantage, but some selection value. Traverse the Alvenwald I listed as a cantrip as well, because you can play it turn 1 to find another basic land. And if you have Delirium, it's even a small tutor finding any land or any creature, so this is also, so to speak, it's the same as a cantrip. It gives you certain card selection advantage, but not real plus cards. Then there is creatures who are cantrips, like Baleful Strix, which is the classic, and Icefang Kotal, which came as an addition with the Modern Horizons. Flying Death Touch creatures that cantrip and can trade for value. Of course, one has to mention that these cantrips don't go to the graveyard instantly, which makes them not really delve fuel cantrips, but the small cost and draw card thing lets them be treated as cantrips as well. Another sweet cantrip from Modern Horizons is Arkham's Astrolabe, which doesn't do any card selection, it simply replaces itself, and filters mana, which is very important against Blood Moon strategies, which are always a threat for 3-color decks that run a ton of non-basics. We'll talk about the Manabase in a minute. And a new addition from Ikoria is the Shark Typhoon, which is for 2 mana a cantrip that simply replaces itself and does nothing, and every additional mana creates shark tokens, and you might even play it as hard cast, but this rarely happens. So it's another very, very good cantrip that came into being recently. So, and all these cantrips fuel our grave for the delve threats, and we don't only play delve threats, but other threats as well. So the delve threats would be the classical Gurmag Angler, simply 5/5, with delve for 7, and Tazigor the Golden Fang, which is actually worse than the fish, although it's rare and legendary. And the legendary makes it worse because there is Caracas around, which frequently bounces the Tazigor and annihilating the value, but it's still good enough to be run as a delve threat. A relatively new delve creature is the Ethereal Forager from one commander set, which is a 3/3 flyer for 6, and you get the instants and sorceries that are delved away with that guy when you attack. So you get one of the delved instant or sorceries to your hand whenever you attack with this guy. When this is answered instantly, it doesn't do much, but when it's not answered, once you can untap and attack with this guy, it creates a hell lot of value. So it's a really nice addition. So this is the 3 actual creatures with delve, but there is more creatures that profit from the graveyard and from the cantripping. So once there is the Elvish Reclaimer, which profits from lands in the graveyard and can also do some land tutoring for value, although I don't have the land package, land win conditions in this deck, but that would be an option to include this. And another Tarmogoyf is a classical beatstick, a cheap threat that also enjoys a full graveyard. Uro, of course, is also happy about every cantrip in the graveyard as escape fuel. In a way, Jace Vryn's Prodigy also is happy about the cantrips, which makes him flip faster, although, of course, sometimes you want the Looter not to flip, because the Looter is actually better than the Planeswalker, but in general, that's not a big deal. And the other threats that this deck runs are based on, how much value can one get for moderate casting costs in these colors, and this leads to some of the best Planeswalkers there are in the 3 and 4 mana slot, which is Jace the Mind Sculptor, the 2 Lilianas for 3, Nazit Pater of Veils, which is an insane card, and not to talk about Oko, which is also quite a okay magic card. And more cheap threats that we have are Leovold, Brazen Borrower, Tireless Tracker, which are around for a while and are known to create nice value, and with Commander Legends just being released, Opposition Agent and Hull Breacher seem reasonable inclusions into every deck that can cast them, because drawing extra cards, for example via cantrips, or searching their libraries via fetchlands and tutors is a thing that really, really frequently happens in Highlander, so I cannot see not playing them in a generic mid-range deck that can support them. So much about the threats. What else do we have? So apart from cantrips, we can also fill the grave with some other means, which would be, for example, Fact or Fiction, which looks on the first hand like an antique and rather clunky draw spell, but the fact that you get to choose which pile to take can always guarantee you to get 4 cards into the graveyard, Fact or Fiction itself, and the bigger pile, which is 3 cards minimum. And you can also, if the opponent puts the strongest card in a single pile and the rest in the other pile, you can more often than not happily pick the 1 card pile and have 5 other cards in the graveyard for Delve or Escape Fuel, which is very nice. Intuition has been added to the deck once Uro was printed, because Intuition with Uro in is just pain in the ass for the opponent. It's not a fun thing to choose Intuition piles when Uro is included. Search for Escanta also has the potential to mill oneself, and thus creating graveyard fuel, and Dig Through Time is the remaining draw spell that also has Delve and profits from the graveyard. As you might know, Treasure Cruise was banned recently. Of course, this was in the deck before and has been replaced now, I think, with one of the Commander Legends prints. And yeah, Demonic Tutor is in this deck. I think I will in due time produce a video devoted to Demonic Tutor itself. I think it's a fine card in Highlander. It's difficult to argue for this card to be fine in times of combo decks, but the fact that I don't include it automatically into all my mid-range decks leads to my assumption that this card is actually fine. In this deck it's quite good, but not insane. For example, in my Mardu mid-range tokens deck, I don't play it because it simply doesn't create enough value. So in this deck it's quite nice to dig for some specific solutions that might be necessary, but sometimes it's rather clunky cantrip only. But yeah, I think it's good enough in this shell to run it. What else is there? So this section, Manadorks, I mean, it can plainly be seen that these 4 creatures can generate mana at a self-cost of 1. The more interesting part is what is not here, which is all the other Manadorks that do this. So I opted to run only the multicolor Manadorks that can provide different colors of mana, and I didn't choose to run Lanova Elves, Swinton Elves, and the like. Simply because when I built this deck, there was lots of answers to early Manadorks around, and I didn't want to be vulnerable to that. Also, I'm not a ramp deck, so I don't need tons of mana, so it's not necessary to run the full package, but having this package, which provides multicolor mana and has some random other upsides, Death Shaman has some insane abilities in the format, and Gilded Goose is also very nice with a food creating ability. And this proved to be very nice. So you don't need the full package of Manadorks. The 4 tops here is simply enough. Then there is a section that I turned further grave stuff. Snapcaster is a recursion engine, which is always a fine card. Entomb is insane since Uro has been printed, and I've won many games entombing into Uro. And if you don't entomb into Uro, then you probably get Life from the Loam to create more value, dredging, filling the graveyard, getting you extra lands, maybe recovering from wasteland attacks and stuff the like. An experimental slot is the Maya Triton, which is fine against aggro, trades against everything, gives you 2 life, and mills you 2 cards. So, so far it performs quite nicely. It's not insane. It might be replaced at some point by a better 2-drop once the power creep has reached that position. But at the moment I feel no need to cut it, although it's not the most performing card, but it's fine. It's some grease to the engine, if you will. Then, apart from the counter spells, we also have some removal spells, and this is one of the reasons, aside from the Uro Oko aspect, to run green actually, because Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy are very, very good removal spells, providing answers to many threats in the field for a cost of black-green, which is very fine. Sweet new addition is Drawn in the Loch. Of course, it needs the opponent to have a graveyard themselves, so this is sometimes bad if you play against other Delve decks, because once they put their Delve spell on the stack, they might not have a graveyard anymore. But usually this is a removal/counterspell modal spell that really does a lot. And then Fatal Push has always been there as a cheap interaction removal, and I currently test the Bloodchief's Thirst which is, I think, the only card from the Zendikar Rising in the deck, which is quite similar to Fatal Push. It's only sorcery speed, but it can also target Planeswalkers, and I have cast this card with Kicker, for example, to get rid of Liliana's or Oracles, and this is quite a nice thing. It's a bit of a meta choice whether you want mass removal in. I think they are quite nice to recover from board states which are otherwise unrecoverable. I run a huge amount of mass removals, which is 3 at the moment, which is Damnation, Dead of Winter, and Toxic Deluge. You might have noticed that I have a certain snow theme with the Arkham's Astrolabe and the Icefang Kotal as well. And so I have options in this deck to reset the board state if necessary. It's debatable whether 3 is maybe not one too much, and maybe one could replace one of these mass removals with a tutor to be more flexible, but at the moment I think this package works quite well. One word about the choice of counterspells in this deck. So I run only 9 counterspells, which would be more in several other mid-range builds, and of course more in control builds. And yeah, I don't have that much space, and I'm not fully relying on counter magic here, as I have removal and hand control as additional answers. So I only played the 9 counter spells that cost less than 3 mana to cast. So the forces can be counted as 0 mana spells. And so these are the counter spells, the core counter spells that are the most important as low cost answers to the majority of spells on the format. So these are the spells that are run in this deck. The part that is missing, of course, is the Manabase. The Manabase is very, very conservative. So I simply run all fetch lands and all dual lands, all shock duels that are available. I run one of the triumphs that is exactly in these colors. I don't feel the need to run partly off-color triumphs. And of course Wasteland is in there. I run both of the card draw lands that fit the colors, so Nurturing Peatland and Waterlogged Grove, which have performed quite nicely. I don't feel the need to run an additional one, which would be partly off-color as well, because the pain is not irrelevant. So against aggressive matchups, this can literally be a pain in the ass. So I think 2 is the maximum number of these kind of lands to run in this deck. Ash Barrens is a fine thing to find basic lands, so I love this card in 3 color decks. Probably I would run it in most 2 color decks as well. And Botanical Sanctum is the only fast land, so it's simple. There was one more slot that seemed to require multicolor mana, so at the moment it is Botanical Sanctum, which I run because it is untapped in the early game, and in the early game you need green and blue mana to cast Manadorks or Cantrips. One Ancient Remnant is the Creeping Tar Pit, which feels a little bit overtaken by power level in the meantime, but it's still a nice uncounterable thing that can handle Planeswalkers on the opposing side, and it ever and ever again performs quite well doing exactly that, and so I kept this card in for this reason. And of course the mana base is snow, and it runs a lot of basic lands. So this is a design choice that I love to make in my 3-color Highlander decks. I hate it to lose against Blood Moon effects, so I tune the deck in a way that I lean as much as I can towards basic lands and away from non-basic lands. And this amount of basic lands also makes things like Arkham's Astrolabe playable, because it needs snow mana, and with 11 basic lands and I think a total of 10 fetch lands if you count Ash Barrens and Prismatic Vista, this is a reasonable amount to quite certainly have snow mana on the first turn if you need it. And the amount of basic lands helps not to lose against Blood Moon effects or other non-basic land hate, which is frequent in the format. Of course, you could say, well, I accept to lose every now and then against land hate and build the mana base more stable by running all the duels that are available. But yeah, that's really up to you to decide what you want. I always like my decks to be moonproof, and so I build it like this. So let's briefly talk about what I don't play and what might be possible alternatives for this deck. So a friend of mine runs a Sultai Midrange Highlander with the Tutors Oracle package as a finishing move, which would require to add some more tutors, such as Imperial Seal, probably Demonic Consultation, which teams up nicely with Tutors Oracle and Tainted Pact. So this would make this deck not really a combo deck, but a mid-range deck with a combo finish. Of course, Tainted Pact would then demand that you rebuild the mana base. You couldn't do the 11 basic lands moonproof thingy that I did for this build, but you would need different lands in order not to fail with the Tainted Pact. You could of course run a snow-covered and a normal forest, and this for each basic land type, because Tainted Pact is interested in the names, but you cannot do more than 6 basic lands in a 3-color deck for Tainted Pact. So this would be one option, and it might be a very good choice at the moment, actually, because the Tutors Oracle finish is just so very good that it might really be a good option to do that. I don't do that because I don't like it, and I feel that Tutors Oracle might require a ban in the near future, so I don't want to rely too much on that card and rather try out different stuff. Yeah, but I think in general, this is probably a powerful idea. Another package that could be added would be the Lands package, which could draw power from Field of the Dead and from the Dark Depths combo, which can already with other lands such as Thespian Stage and Vesuva create the Married Large token, and with the Elvish Reclaimer already in the deck, with Intuition and Life from the Loam in the deck, this is a package that could be easily added, although this would also require retuning the mana base, probably moving away from too many basic lands. And there are some good stuff cards. I actually run Spellseeker and Thief of Sanity for quite a while, but they've got kicked out in the last update because I wanted to try out Bloodchief's Thirst and the 2 Commander Legends 3-drops, which demanded some cuts, and these were the 2 that were hit. I could imagine trying out Nighthawk Scavenger, which is, yeah, it's not interested in your graveyard, so what you do with your cantrips and grave filling strategies, it doesn't matter. But if the meta is very aggro heavy, then Nighthawk Scavenger could be a very important addition. The classical Vampire Nighthawk felt always too weak. I have tried this in earlier versions of this deck, but 2-3 is just not impressive. Nighthawk Scavenger, which can easily be a 4-3 or even better, could be a thing. Of course, it dies to Lightning Bolt, but many things do that. And if this stays on the board for 1 round against aggro, then you have probably already gained a large advantage. And another thing, you could also run Tombstalker if you wanted to maximize the delve value. I used to run this card in earlier versions, and it was always fine. I needed to cut it once Uro and Cling to Dust made their way in, because this is simply too much hunger for the graveyard cards to afford a Tombstalker. And at the moment, the balance of graveyard feeding cards that you saw was quite fine. This is running very smoothly. If you included more delve spells, you would have to cut out other escape cards or make sure to even mill yourself more. And that being said, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll meet in the next Highlander video here on Blutzer Feuerball. Enjoy and bye bye.